Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, especially the kind that comes wrapped in family love, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to Narrative Nest. I never thought my family would be the place where I learned what it felt like to be invisible. Not unseen exactly, but overlooked in a way that was deliberate, quiet, polite. The kind that leaves no bruises, only questions you carry alone. Growing up, I was the easy child, that's what my parents called me. The one who didn't need much, the one who didn't ask. My sister Lily, on the other hand, was the spark, emotional, demanding, always needing something more attention, more reassurance, more forgiveness. And somehow, without anyone ever saying it out loud, that made her the priority. I learned early not to compete. When Lily cried, my parents ran. When I succeeded, they smiled, nodded, and moved on. I told myself it was fine. I told myself love didn't have to be equal to be real. But there was one person who never made me feel like I had to earn space in the room. My grandmother, Eleanor, Grandma Ellie to me. She had a way of listening that made you feel like your words mattered even before you spoke them. When my parents were busy juggling Lily's latest crisis, Grandma would sit with me at the kitchen table, sliding a mug of tea toward me, asking about my day like it was the most important story she'd hear all week. She saw me completely. And I think she knew long before I did that one day I'd need proof of that. When I was 16, Grandma pulled me aside during one of our Sunday dinners. Lily was in the living room complaining about a boy who hadn't texted back. My parents were hovering around her like she might shatter. Grandma touched my arm gently and asked me to help her fetch something from her bedroom. Once the door closed, she opened a small wooden box from her dresser. Inside were papers, legal-looking ones. She didn't explain much, just said she'd set aside something for me, for my future. College, a home, a safety net. She said, "I want you to have something that's just yours, something no one can take away." I remember laughing nervously, telling her she didn't need to do that. She smiled, the kind that told me she'd already made up her mind. "Promise me," she said, "you won't let anyone guilt you out of what's meant for you." I promised. I didn't know then how heavy that promise would become. Years passed. I went to college on scholarships and part-time jobs. Lily stayed closer to home, bouncing between interests, never quite settling. My parents supported her through everything: missed semesters, new hobbies, sudden dreams that faded as quickly as they appeared. I didn't resent Lily, not really. I resented the imbalance, the quiet assumption that I'd be fine no matter what, while she needed saving again and again. When Grandma's health began to fail, everything shifted. Hospice visits turned into hospice meetings. The woman who once hummed while baking pies now struggled to lift her head. I visited as often as I could, sitting by her bed, holding her hand, talking about small things. She asked about my job, my apartment, my plans. She never asked about Lily. That should have told me something. After she passed, grief settled over the family like thick fog. At the reading of the will, my parents sat close together, Lily between them. I sat slightly apart, hands folded, heart pounding. I expected Grandma's promise to surface then, officially, cleanly. Instead, the lawyer spoke in general terms. The estate would be managed by my parents, assets distributed as outlined. Nothing specific was said to me. I felt a flicker of confusion, then guilt for even thinking about money at a time like that. Later, when I asked my mother gently about it, she waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, honey, everything's being handled. Your grandmother trusted us." My father nodded. Lily avoided my eyes. I told myself I must have misunderstood, that Grandma's gift was symbolic, not literal, that love didn't always come in paperwork. 3 months later, Lily pulled into the driveway in a brand new car, shiny, expensive, the kind you don't buy on a whim. My parents stood outside smiling like they'd just accomplished something noble. Lily squealed, hugged them, cried happy tears. I stood on the porch, my stomach sinking as the pieces clicked together in my head. That wooden box, those papers, Grandma's voice telling me not to let anyone take what was meant for me. That night I asked, calmly, carefully. My parents didn't deny it. My mother sighed like I was being difficult. She said, "We used some of the inheritance. Lily needed a reliable car. You're doing fine. You don't even drive much." My father added, "Family helps family. Grandma would have wanted that." Something broke in me then, not loudly, just a quiet fracture. I reminded them of what Grandma had told me. My mother frowned, said I was misremembering. Lily snapped that I was being selfish. I went home and cried in my car, hands shaking on the steering wheel, feeling foolish for ever believing that something could be just mine. What I didn't know, what none of them realized, was that Grandma had planned for this, and even from hospice she had made sure her voice would still be heard. I didn't confront them again after that night. I wish I could say I fought harder, raised my voice, demanded answers, but the truth is, I went quiet. That had always been my role, the easy one, the understanding one. I told myself that money wasn't worth tearing a family apart, even though something inside me already felt torn. I focused on work, took extra shifts, stayed late just so I wouldn't have to think about it. Every time I saw Lily's car parked outside my parents' house, gleaming like a trophy, I felt a dull ache behind my ribs. Not jealousy exactly. It was grief mixed with disbelief. Grief for my grandmother, disbelief that her last act of love toward me had been brushed aside so casually. A few weeks later, my phone rang while I was at work. The number was unfamiliar, but something made me step outside to answer it. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Marlene, the hospice social worker who had been assigned to my grandmother. Her voice was gentle but firm, the kind of voice that carries weight without raising volume. She asked if I had a moment to talk privately. I remember leaning against the brick wall behind the building, the sun too bright, my heart suddenly racing. She told me she was calling because my grandmother had left specific instructions to be carried out after her passing, not just legal ones, but personal ones. Marlene said Grandma had made a phone call from hospice the week before she died, when her voice was weak but her mind was sharp. That call, Marlene explained, was documented, recorded, and it concerned me. I felt my knees weaken. I asked what she meant, and Marlene paused before saying, "Your grandmother was very clear that a portion of her estate was intended solely for you. She was worried it might be redirected." I didn't speak for a long moment. I could hear traffic in the distance, my own breathing loud in my ears. I told Marlene what had happened, about the car, about my parents saying Grandma would have wanted it that way. When I finished, Marlene sighed softly. "I was afraid of that," she said. She explained that Grandma had anticipated resistance. That's why she'd insisted on an independent witness. That's why she'd made that final call. Grandma had told Marlene everything, how she'd seen the imbalance between her grandchildren, how she feared I'd be taken advantage of because I didn't like conflict. She'd asked Marlene to make sure I knew the truth if anything felt wrong. We met 2 days later. Marlene slid a folder across the table at a quiet cafe. Inside were copies of documents I'd never seen, amendments to the will, a notarized statement, and a transcript of that final call. I couldn't bring myself to read it all at once. Seeing Grandma's words in black and white felt like reopening a wound I'd barely stitched shut. Marlene told me I had options, legal ones. She wasn't pushy. She just laid everything out calmly, respectfully, the way Grandma always did. That night, I drove to my parents' house. I don't know what I expected. Maybe an apology, maybe denial, but I needed to hear them explain it again, knowing what I now knew. Lily's car was there, of course. She was in the living room scrolling on her phone when I walked in. My parents looked surprised, then guarded. I told them about Marlene, about the call, about the documents. My mother's face drained of color. My father stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back. They tried to explain. They said they hadn't meant to hurt me, that Lily was struggling, that it was temporary, that they planned to make it right someday. I asked them why they hadn't told me the truth from the beginning, why they'd let me believe I was imagining things. My mother started crying, saying she felt judged. Lily finally spoke, accusing me of going behind their backs, of being ungrateful, of choosing money over family. That's when I realized something painful and freeing at the same time. They weren't hearing me. They were hearing a threat to the version of themselves they wanted to believe in, the generous parents, the fair family. Admitting what they'd done meant admitting they'd failed me, and that was something they weren't ready to face. I left without yelling, without slamming doors, just a quiet goodbye. In my car, I listened to the voicemail Marlene had included, the recording of Grandma's final call. Her voice was thin but steady. She spoke my name with such certainty it made my chest ache. She said she loved me. She said she hoped I'd forgive her for not doing more while she was alive. She said, "Please don't let them tell you this is what I wanted. I know my family. That's why I'm saying this out loud." I cried until I couldn't anymore. Then I made a decision I never thought I'd have the courage to make. I contacted a lawyer. The process was slow, uncomfortable, and exhausting. My parents were furious when they received notice. Lily blocked my number. Extended family members started calling, some supportive, some accusing me of tearing everyone apart. I questioned myself constantly. Was I being cruel, greedy, disloyal? Every doubt faded when I replayed Grandma's message. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about truth, about honoring the one person who had always shown up for me without conditions. Months passed before anything was resolved. During that time, I learned how deep denial can run. My parents tried to negotiate privately, offering partial repayment if I dropped the claim. Lily posted vague things online about betrayal and selfishness. I stayed quiet. I let the documents speak. I let Grandma's voice speak. When the settlement finally came through, it was exactly what Grandma had intended. No more, no less. Holding that check didn't make me feel triumphant. It made me feel seen, validated, like my story hadn't been erased after all. But the cost was heavy. My relationship with my parents was strained beyond recognition. Holidays passed without invitations. Silence replaced routine. Still, something unexpected happened. In the quiet that followed, I began to understand the lesson Grandma was trying to teach me all along. Love doesn't require self-erasure. Loyalty doesn't mean accepting injustice. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is stop being the easy one. The silence that followed the settlement was louder than any argument we'd ever had. At first, I kept expecting my phone to buzz with a message from my mother, something tentative and awkward, maybe even angry, but reaching out all the same. It never came. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. I learned what it felt like to exist outside the rhythm of a family that at once dictated the shape of my life. No Sunday dinners, no group chats, no obligatory check-ins, just space. too much space at first. Then, slowly, the kind you can breathe in. I wish I could say I felt at peace right away, but that wouldn't be honest. There were nights I lay awake replaying every conversation, wondering if I could have handled things differently, if I'd waited longer, if I'd explained myself better. The doubt crept in during quiet moments when the world wasn't distracting me enough. I wondered if I'd proven my parents right, that I was cold, distant, ungrateful. I wondered if Lily truly believed I'd stolen something from her instead of reclaimed what was mine. One afternoon, while cleaning out a box I'd brought home from my parents' attic years ago, I found a photo album I didn't remember taking. Inside were pictures of me and Grandma, just us, at the zoo, baking cookies, sitting on the porch swing. On the inside cover, in her familiar looping handwriting, she'd written, "For the one who listens." I sat on the floor and cried again, but this time the tears felt different, softer, less desperate, like grief finally had somewhere safe to land. Around that time, my Aunt Carol, my mother's older sister, reached out. She hadn't taken sides publicly, which I'd noticed and appreciated. We met for coffee. She studied me for a long moment before speaking, like she was seeing me clearly for the first time. Then she told me something I'd never known. My mother had grown up in Lily's shadow, always the overlooked one, always the reliable one. When Lily was born, my mother swore she'd never let her child feel the way she had. Somewhere along the way, she'd overcorrected. Protecting Lily became instinct. Fairness became optional. Hearing that didn't excuse what happened, but it added context. It helped me understand that patterns don't start with us. They're inherited, just like eye color and stubbornness. The difference is whether we choose to pass them on unchanged. A few weeks later, Lily emailed me. Not an apology, not an attack, just a short message asking to talk. I stared at it for a long time before replying. We met in a park halfway between our apartments. She looked older somehow, tired. The car sat parked nearby, no longer shiny, just another object. She told me she felt embarrassed, that she hadn't realized the money was meant specifically for me, that our parents had framed it as a family resource, not a promise broken. She admitted she'd enjoyed being chosen without asking why. I told her how it felt to always be the afterthought, to be told over and over that I didn't need what I was promised because I was strong enough without it. We didn't resolve everything that day, but for the first time, we spoke without shouting, without roles, just two adults acknowledging a shared history that had hurt us both in different ways. My parents took longer, much longer. My father eventually called, his voice stiff, apologizing for the legal fight, but not the choice that led to it. My mother sent a letter, pages long, defensive in places, regretful in others. She said she still didn't agree with how I'd handled things, but she missed me. I sat with that letter for days before responding. I told her I loved her, that I hoped one day we could talk honestly, without rewriting the past to make it easier to swallow. In the months that followed, I used part of the inheritance to do exactly what Grandma had hoped. I paid off my student loans. I started a small savings account labeled Freedom. I didn't buy anything flashy. I didn't announce anything online. The money wasn't a victory lap. It was a foundation, one built on someone believing in me enough to protect me even after she was gone. Sometimes I still hear Grandma's voice when I'm unsure of myself, telling me not to shrink, reminding me that being kind doesn't mean being quiet when you're wronged, that love, real love, makes room instead of taking it. I don't know if my family will ever fully heal. Some fractures don't disappear, they just settle into the shape of your life. But I do know this. That final phone call from Hospice wasn't about revenge. It was about balance, about restoring something that had been quietly taken. And in honoring it, I finally learned to honor myself. Time has a strange way of smoothing sharp edges while leaving the shape of the wound intact. By the time a full year had passed since the settlement, my life looked calm from the outside. New routines, a steadier confidence at work, mornings that began without the weight of waiting for someone else's approval. But underneath that calm was a constant awareness that something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer orbiting my family's gravity. I was standing on my own ground, and that came with both freedom and loneliness. The first holiday season without them was the hardest. I told myself I didn't care, that holidays were just dates on a calendar. But when December rolled around, the ache returned. I decorated my apartment modestly, a small tree in the corner, white lights only. On Christmas Eve, I cooked a simple dinner for myself and tried not to think about the noise that would be filling my parents' house, the laughter, the clinking glasses, Lily's voice rising above everyone else's. I wondered if there was an empty chair they didn't talk about. I wondered if Grandma's absence still lingered there the way it did with me. That night, I dreamed of her. She was sitting at the kitchen table, exactly as she used to, folding napkins with careful precision. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me with that steady, knowing expression. When I woke up, I didn't feel sad. I felt anchored, like her presence had followed me forward, not stayed behind. In January, my mother called unexpectedly. I almost didn't answer. My thumb hovered over the screen while my heart raced like I was 16 again, bracing for disappointment. When I finally picked up, her voice sounded older, softer. She asked how I was, really was, and for once, she waited for the answer. We talked for 20 minutes about neutral things, weather, work, a recipe she'd tried. Before hanging up, she said quietly, "I still don't know how to fix this, but I know pretending nothing happened won't work anymore." It wasn't an apology, but it was the first crack in the wall. Over the next few months, our conversations became more frequent, still cautious, still layered with things unsaid. My father remained distant. Lily and I texted occasionally, surface-level updates that hinted at something deeper neither of us was ready to touch. I learned to accept relationships as they were, not as I wished they could be. That acceptance felt like a muscle I was strengthening slowly, deliberately. One afternoon, Marlene, the hospice social worker, reached out again. She said she was organizing a small remembrance gathering for families of patients who had passed, a space to honor final wishes and unspoken truths. She invited me, saying my grandmother's story had stayed with her. I almost declined, afraid it would reopen everything I'd worked so hard to stabilize, but something told me to go. The gathering was quiet, intimate. People shared stories of last words, final gestures, unexpected acts of courage. When it was my turn, I spoke about Grandma's phone call, about how she'd known, even from a hospital bed, that love sometimes needs witnesses, that care isn't just about warmth, it's about foresight. When I finished, a woman across the room wiped her eyes and said, "Your grandmother trusted you with the truth. That's powerful." That word stayed with me. Trusted. Not protected, not favored. Trusted. Grandma hadn't just given me money, she'd given me responsibility. The responsibility to speak up, to stand firm, to break a pattern that survived on silence. Later that spring, Lily asked to meet again. This time, she suggested my apartment. When she arrived, she looked around slowly, taking in the space I'd built. She said it felt peaceful. Then she surprised me by apologizing, not for the car exactly, but for the years of taking without asking, of assuming there would always be more for her because there always had been. She admitted she'd sold the car months earlier, used the money to pay off debt she'd been hiding from everyone. She said the whole situation had forced her to see herself differently. I listened. I didn't rush to forgive. Forgiveness, I'd learned, isn't a performance, it's a process. But I thanked her for the honesty. For the first time, our conversation didn't feel like a competition for oxygen. As summer approached, my parents invited me to dinner, a neutral restaurant, public, safe. I went, heart pounding, expectations low. The meal was awkward at first, then my father cleared his throat and said something I never thought I'd hear. He said they'd been wrong. Not misguided, not misunderstood, wrong. He said they'd let fear guide them. Fear of Lily failing, fear of conflict, fear of admitting they'd played favorites. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He said he understood if I wasn't ready. I drove home that night in silence, the city lights blurring through tears I hadn't expected, not because everything was fixed, but because something fundamental had shifted again, this time toward truth. Grandma used to say that inheritance isn't just what you receive, it's what you refuse to carry forward. As I look at my family now, imperfect, healing, still learning, I understand what she meant. The money helped, yes, but the real gift was the moment I stopped shrinking to keep others comfortable, the moment I honored her final call by answering it with my life. Healing, I learned, doesn't arrive all at once. It shows up in fragments, small moments that don't announce themselves as progress until you look back and realize how far you've come. After that dinner with my parents, I didn't suddenly feel whole. I felt cautious, hopeful in a quiet way, like standing on thin ice that hasn't cracked yet, but still listening for the sound. My relationship with my parents settled into something new. We spoke more honestly than we ever had, though still carefully, like people learning a language they'd avoided for decades. My mother admitted how hard it was for her to sit with the idea that loving one child more loudly had caused another to feel forgotten. She said she used to tell herself I didn't mind because I never complained. Hearing that hurt in a fresh way, but it also clarified something important. Silence is often mistaken for consent. I told her how often I'd swallowed disappointment to keep the peace, how being easy had slowly taught me that my needs were optional. She cried then, not theatrically, just a few quiet tears that felt real. She said she wished Grandma were still here to tell her how badly she'd misunderstood strength. I told her Grandma already had, from hospice, and that maybe this was her lesson too. Lily and I started meeting for coffee every few weeks. Sometimes we talked about nothing. Sometimes we circled old wounds, careful not to reopen them too fast. She told me she was in therapy now, that she was learning how much of her identity had been built around being rescued. That confession stayed with me. It made me realize how damaging favoritism can be, not just to the overlooked child, but to the one being favored. Dependence disguised as love. One evening, Lily asked me something that caught me off guard. She asked if I thought Grandma had loved her less. I shook my head immediately. I told her Grandma loved us differently because we needed different things. Lily needed protection from herself. I needed protection from everyone else. Lily nodded slowly, like something had finally clicked into place. As summer faded into fall, I found myself thinking less about the inheritance as an event and more about it as a turning point. Before it, I had lived reactively, responding to expectations, smoothing tensions, shrinking my own wants. After it, I started making choices without rehearsing how they'd be received. I applied for a leadership role at work I never would have considered before. I took a solo trip, something I'd always postponed because it felt indulgent. Each decision felt like a quiet act of defiance against the old version of myself. On the anniversary of Grandma's passing, I visited her grave alone. I brought fresh flowers and that old photo album. I read her final phone call transcript out loud, my voice steady now. I told her what had happened since, the fights, the silence, the slow repair. I thanked her for seeing me when I didn't know how to see myself. As I stood there, the wind moved through the trees, gentle and constant, and for the first time the grief felt complete. Not gone, complete. Later that evening, my parents came by my apartment. No agenda, no speeches, just dessert and coffee. My father lingered by the window looking out at the city lights and said he was proud of me. Not for winning, not for being strong, just proud. The simplicity of it almost undid me. I realized then that reconciliation isn't about returning to what was. It's about building something new with the truth laid bare. Some pieces never fit the same way again, and that's okay. What matters is that they fit honestly. People sometimes ask if it was worth it, the conflict, the legal fight, the risk of losing my family. I tell them the same thing every time. It wasn't about the money. It was about refusing to disappear quietly. It was about answering a dying woman's trust with courage instead of compliance. Grandma once told me that fairness feels radical in families built on habit. I didn't understand that until I challenged those habits and watched everything wobble. But wobbling doesn't mean falling. Sometimes it means adjusting, finding a new center. As I sit here now telling this story, I know there will always be echoes of what happened. Certain conversations will always carry extra weight. Certain holidays will feel different. But I also know this: my voice is no longer optional in my own life, and that may be the greatest inheritance of all. By the time winter returned, the story had settled into my bones, not as a wound, but as a reminder, something I carried with awareness instead of pain. Life didn't slow down to give me space to process everything. I had deadlines, responsibilities, ordinary stresses, but I noticed that I handled them differently now. I no longer apologized for needing clarity. I no longer softened my words to protect other people from discomfort that wasn't mine to manage. That change wasn't loud or confrontational. It was quiet and steady, like a spine finally remembering its shape. My parents and I fell into a rhythm that worked, even if it wasn't perfect. We met occasionally, talked more honestly, and avoided pretending the past had never happened. That alone felt like progress. My mother once admitted she'd replayed Grandma's hospice call in her head after hearing about it from the lawyer. She said it haunted her, not out of anger, but recognition. She knew us better than we knew ourselves, my mother said, staring into her cup of tea. I didn't argue. Some truths don't need defending. Lily surprised me again that winter. She showed up at my place one evening with a small box. Inside was a simple bracelet Grandma used to wear. Nothing valuable, just silver, slightly tarnished. Lily said she'd found it while cleaning out some old boxes and felt it belonged with me. Not because I deserved it more, she said, but because Grandma had trusted me to hold the truth, and this felt like part of that trust. I hugged her without thinking. It was the first time in years it felt natural instead of complicated. I started volunteering shortly after that, something I'd always meant to do but never prioritized. I worked with a local hospice center, helping families navigate paperwork, resources, the small but overwhelming details that come at the end of life. Every time I sat with someone who was losing a loved one, I thought of Grandma, of her clarity, of her courage. I realized how rare it is for someone to speak plainly at the end, not to soothe others, but to protect them. Being there for those families felt like a way of continuing her work. One afternoon, I met a woman my age who was struggling with her siblings over her father's estate. She spoke softly, apologetically, like she was afraid of taking up space. I recognized myself immediately. I didn't give her advice, I just listened. When she finished, I told her something Grandma once told me, that wanting fairness doesn't make you greedy, and advocating for yourself doesn't make you disloyal. The relief on her face was unmistakable. In that moment, I understood how stories like mine don't end with us, they ripple outward. There were still moments of doubt, moments when an offhand comment from a relative or an awkward silence at a gathering would reopen old insecurities. But now, instead of shrinking, I named them, sometimes only to myself, sometimes out loud. Each time I did, the weight lifted a little faster. As spring approached again, my family gathered for Grandma's birthday, not out of obligation, but intention. We met at the park she loved, brought food she used to cook, shared stories that made us laugh and ache at the same time. At one point, my father raised a toast, not to the past we wished we'd had, but to the honesty we were learning to live with. It wasn't poetic, it was real, and that mattered more. Later that day, my mother pulled me aside. She said something I'll never forget. She said, "I used to think being a good parent meant preventing pain. Now I think it means not causing it when you have a choice." I nodded, feeling something settle into place. We don't get to rewrite our mistakes, but we do get to stop repeating them. That night, alone in my apartment, I thought about the version of myself who'd stood on the porch watching Lily drive away in that car, heartbreaking in silence. I wished I could reach back and tell her what I know now, that the story didn't end there, that being overlooked doesn't mean being unworthy, that sometimes the quietest people are the ones carrying the deepest truth, just waiting for the right moment to speak. Grandma's one call from hospice didn't just correct a financial wrong, it disrupted a family narrative that had gone unchallenged for generations. It forced all of us to look at who we were when no one was watching and who we wanted to be after. That kind of disruption is uncomfortable, painful, necessary. I keep her bracelet on my desk now, not as a reminder of conflict, but of courage, of the power of being specific, of love that doesn't fade when it's inconvenient. Every time I catch it in the light, I remember that even at the end, even when her body was failing, Grandma chose to speak clearly, and in doing so, she taught me to live clearly too. There's a strange calm that comes when a story is almost finished, even if the people inside it are still living. By the time another year passed, I could feel that calm settling into my life. Not because everything was perfect, but because nothing felt unresolved anymore. The questions that once kept me awake at night had answers now. Not always satisfying ones, but honest ones. And honesty, I learned, has a way of quieting the mind. My family gatherings became smaller, more intentional. We no longer pretended closeness where there was still healing to be done. Instead, we focused on being present. When my parents came over, my mother asked before giving advice. My father listened more than he spoke. Those might sound like small changes, but in our family, they were monumental. Lily and I had found a rhythm too, one built on mutual accountability instead of imbalance. We still disagreed, still stumbled, but neither of us expected the other to disappear to keep things comfortable. One evening, Lily confessed something that stayed with me. She said that after selling the car, she'd felt an unexpected sense of relief, like she'd finally stepped out of a role she didn't know how to quit. She admitted that being constantly rescued had made her afraid of failing, and that fear had quietly controlled her life. Losing the car hadn't ruined her, it had forced her to grow. Hearing that didn't erase the hurt, but it reframed it. It reminded me that consequences, when paired with honesty, can be gifts too. At work, I was promoted into that leadership role I'd once been too afraid to pursue. During my first team meeting, I caught myself almost deflecting praise, almost minimizing my contribution. Then I stopped. I accepted it, not with arrogance, but with ownership. Later, alone in my office, I thought about Grandma again, how she'd looked at me like she knew exactly who I could become if I stopped stepping aside. Volunteering at hospice continued to ground me. Every family had their own version of unfinished business, regrets, confessions, final gestures. I saw how often people waited too long to say what mattered, assuming there would be more time. Grandma hadn't waited. Even from a hospital bed, she'd chosen clarity over comfort. That choice echoed in every part of my life now. On the second anniversary of her passing, I received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but inside was a note from Marlene. She wrote to tell me she was retiring and wanted me to know that my grandmother's case had changed how she approached her work. "Your grandmother reminded me," she wrote, that advocacy doesn't end with the patient. Sometimes it begins there. I held that letter for a long time, feeling the reach of Grandma's final act extending even further than I'd realized. That night, I sat on my balcony and thought about inheritance, not the financial kind, but the emotional one, the patterns we absorb, the roles we inherit without choosing, the silences passed down like heirlooms. I realized that by speaking up, by refusing to let the truth be rewritten, I'd interrupted something much bigger than one incident. I'd changed the story my family would tell itself going forward. My parents weren't suddenly transformed people. They still struggled, still slipped. But now when they did, they acknowledged it. That acknowledgement mattered more than perfection ever could. My mother once told me she'd started therapy too. She said she wanted to understand why she'd equated love with sacrifice and why she'd always assumed I'd be fine without support. I told her I was proud of her, and I meant it. As for me, I stopped introducing myself as the low-maintenance one. I stopped wearing self-denial like a badge of honor. I learned that taking up space doesn't mean pushing others out. It just means standing where you belong. That lesson reshaped my friendships, my career, my sense of self. Sometimes people ask me if I regret taking legal action against my own parents. The question always carries an edge, like they're testing my humanity. I answer honestly. I regret that it was necessary. I don't regret that I did it. Because letting something go unchallenged doesn't make you kind, it makes the injustice quieter. Grandma once said that families don't break because of conflict, they break because of avoidance. Looking back now, I see how close we came to that kind of break, how easy it would have been for me to swallow the pain and carry it alone, letting resentment rot quietly. Her one call from hospice stopped that from happening. It forced everything into the open where it could finally be dealt with. As I tell this story now, I don't feel anger. I feel gratitude. Gratitude for a woman who loved me enough to plan ahead. Gratitude for the courage I didn't know I had until I needed it. Gratitude for the truth, even when it cost me comfort. There's still one last part of this story, one final reflection that brings everything full circle. And it starts with something Grandma said to me years ago, a sentence I didn't understand until now. Grandma said it on an ordinary afternoon, long before hospice, long before money or wills or broken silences. We were sitting on her porch, the air warm, cicadas humming in the background. I was young then, still learning how to disappear politely. She watched me for a while before saying, almost casually, "One day, you're going to have to decide whether peace is worth the price they ask you to pay for it." I nodded like I understood, but I didn't. Not really. I understand now. That sentence followed me through every part of what happened, through the shock of seeing Lily's new car, through the quiet dismissal of my questions, through the phone call from Marlene that cracked everything open, through courtrooms, strained dinners, long silences, and careful reunions. Peace had been offered to me many times on the condition that I stay quiet, stay agreeable, stay small. Grandma knew I would be tempted to accept it. That's why she made the call. When people hear my story, they often focus on the inheritance, on the money, on the legal fight. But that was never the heart of it. The heart of it was visibility, being acknowledged as someone whose needs mattered, whose memories were real, whose promises counted. The money simply made the truth undeniable. It forced everyone, including me, to stop pretending. I think about the version of my parents I grew up with. Two people doing the best they knew how, repeating patterns they never stopped to question. I don't excuse their choices, but I understand them now. Understanding, I've learned, is not the same as surrender. You can see the reasons behind someone's actions and still hold them accountable. That balance took me a long time to learn. Lily and I are still rebuilding. Some days it feels solid, other days it feels fragile, but it's real. We talk honestly now about favoritism, about damage, about how love can be uneven without being intentional. She once told me she's afraid she'll become our parents if she ever has children. I told her the fact that she's afraid of that means she already won't. Awareness changes everything. As for me, I no longer introduce myself by what I don't need. I don't downplay my hopes or soften my boundaries to make them easier to cross. When something matters to me, I say so. When something hurts, I name it. That doesn't make life smoother, but it makes it truer. And truth, I found, is a much sturdier foundation than false harmony. The inheritance sits quietly now, integrated into my life, no longer a symbol of conflict. Some of it is saved, some of it has been used to build a future Grandma wanted for me, secure, independent, unafraid. But the greatest thing she left me can't be measured. It's the certainty that my voice matters, even when it disrupts, especially when it disrupts. Every now and then, I replay that hospice call, not because I need proof anymore, but because I miss her, her clarity, her resolve, her love. She sounded tired but unshaken, like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. In her final days, when she had every excuse to rest, she chose to act, she chose to protect, she chose to speak. I carry that choice with me. Families like mine don't implode dramatically, they erode quietly through small injustices that go unchallenged because challenging them feels too risky. Grandma interrupted that erosion. She reminded us that love without fairness is incomplete, that silence is not the same as peace, that inheritance is as much about what you pass forward as what you leave behind. If you're listening to this and seeing yourself in it, if you're the one who's always expected to be okay, to need less, to understand more, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not difficult for wanting what was promised. You are not selfish for refusing to disappear. And you are not wrong for choosing truth over comfort. My parents used my inheritance to buy my sister a car. That's the headline. But the real story is this. A dying woman made one call that restored balance, exposed silence, and taught me how to stand in my own life without apology. Her voice reached further than she ever got to see, and because of her, mine finally did too. That is what she left me, and I will spend the rest of my life honoring it. I didn't think there would be more to say after everything felt settled, but life has a way of adding quiet epilogues long after the credits should have rolled. This part of the story didn't arrive with conflict or confrontation. It arrived slowly, in moments so ordinary they almost went unnoticed at first. And yet, they're the moments that proved everything Grandma fought for had actually taken root. It started with a small thing. My mother called me one afternoon, clearly flustered, asking for advice about a decision she was struggling with. Halfway through explaining, she stopped herself and said, "I don't want to assume you'll be okay with whatever I choose. I want to hear what you think." I had to close my eyes for a second when she said that, not because it was dramatic, but because it was new. For the first time, my opinion wasn't an afterthought or a formality. It was invited. My father changed in quieter ways. He started asking questions instead of offering solutions. When I talked about work stress, he didn't jump to fixing it or minimizing it. He listened. Once, after a long pause, he said, "I didn't realize how often we mistook your independence for invulnerability." He didn't say it for reassurance. He said it like a fact he was finally willing to sit with. That mattered more than any grand apology ever could. Lily and I took a trip together that fall. Just a weekend, nothing extravagant. There were awkward moments, of course, but also laughter that felt genuine instead of forced. One night, sitting by a fire pit, she admitted something that stayed with me. She said she used to believe love was proven by who was chosen first. Now she was learning that real love is proven by who is treated fairly, even when it's inconvenient. Hearing that, I realized how deeply Grandma's lesson had reached, not just into my life, but into hers too. At work, I became known as someone who advocated quietly but firmly. I noticed how often people like me, capable, reliable, calm, were overlooked because they didn't demand attention. When I saw it happening, I spoke up. Not aggressively, just clearly. I made sure credit landed where it belonged. I watched confidence bloom in people who reminded me of my younger self. That felt like closing a circle. Volunteering at hospice continued to shape me in unexpected ways. One evening, an elderly man asked me if I believed families could change. I told him the truth, that change doesn't always look like reconciliation, but it can look like accountability, and sometimes that's enough. He smiled and said he hoped someone would be brave enough to hold his family to the truth when he was gone. I thought of Grandma, and I promised myself I'd always be that brave when it mattered. On what would have been her birthday, I started a small tradition. I write her a letter each year. I tell her what's changed, what I'm still learning, what I'm proud of. Sometimes I read the letters back and realize how far I've come, not just in circumstances, but in self-respect. The person writing those letters no longer asks for permission to exist fully. The inheritance itself no longer feels heavy. It's simply part of my life now, integrated and quiet. The real weight has shifted into something else, a responsibility to live honestly, to notice when old patterns try to resurface, to stop them gently but firmly when they do, to remember that being the easy one was never a virtue, it was a survival skill I no longer need. I've come to understand that Grandma didn't make that hospice call because she expected chaos. She made it because she expected resistance. She knew that truth often needs reinforcement, especially when it disrupts comfort. Her call was an anchor, something solid enough to hold when everything else started to sway. If there's a final lesson in all of this, it's this: you don't owe your silence to anyone, not to keep the peace, not to preserve appearances, not to protect people from the consequences of their own choices. Love that demands your erasure isn't love, it's convenience. My family isn't perfect now, it never will be, but it's real in a way it wasn't before, and I am real in it, not edited, not minimized, not quietly absorbing the cost of everyone else's comfort. That is the future Grandma imagined for me, one where I didn't just survive the family I was born into, but helped transform it by refusing to disappear. Her one call from hospice didn't just correct an injustice, it taught me how to live the rest of my life standing upright, with my voice intact. And that lesson didn't end with her, it continues every time I choose honesty over ease, truth over silence, and self-respect over approval. That's how the story truly ends, not with revenge, not with loss, but with balance restored and a voice that finally knows it deserves to be heard. I didn't realize at first that this would be the last chapter, because real endings rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly, disguised as ordinary days, until one moment makes you stop and realize something inside you has finally settled. For me, that moment came on an unremarkable morning, standing in my kitchen, watching sunlight spill across the counter while I made coffee. There was no phone call, no memory rushing in, no ache behind my ribs. Just calm. And that's when I knew the story had finished telling itself. For so long, my life had been shaped by reaction, reacting to expectations, reacting to imbalance, reacting to being the one who was supposed to understand, adjust, and endure. Even after everything with the inheritance was resolved, I carried a quiet vigilance, like I was waiting for the ground to shift again. That morning, for the first time, I wasn't bracing for anything. I was simply present. And presence, I've learned, is what closure actually feels like. My relationship with my parents had settled into something honest, if not perfect. We didn't talk every day, we didn't pretend the past hadn't happened, but we no longer danced around it either. When old habits surfaced, they were acknowledged instead of denied. When boundaries were tested, they were respected instead of challenged. That may not sound extraordinary, but in a family built on avoidance, it was revolutionary. One afternoon, my mother said something that felt like a full circle moment. We were folding laundry together, an ordinary task that used to be filled with small tensions. She looked at me and said, "I wish I had asked more questions instead of making assumptions about you." There was no defensiveness in her voice, just truth. I told her I wished I'd learned sooner that being quiet didn't mean being strong. We stood there for a moment, surrounded by half-folded clothes and years of unspoken understanding finally spoken. That was enough. Lily and I had reached a place that felt steady, not overly close, not distant, balanced. We respected each other's autonomy now. She no longer looked to me to absorb the emotional cost of family dynamics, and I no longer felt responsible for cushioning her from discomfort. One day, she told me she'd started making decisions without calling our parents first. She laughed nervously when she said it, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to admit it. I smiled and told her that sounded like growth, and it was. At work, I continued to lead with the same quiet firmness that had once been mistaken for passivity. The difference now was that I didn't let others define it for me. When I spoke clearly. When I disagreed, I didn't apologize for it. I watched how that permission, given first to myself, made space for others to do the same. Sometimes people don't need inspiration, they need an example that doesn't come wrapped in noise. Volunteering at hospice remained part of my life, but my role shifted. I was no longer there to process my own grief, I was there to witness others as they navigated theirs. I saw how many families avoided hard conversations, assuming love would cover what silence left undone. I saw how often it didn't. Each time I silently thanked Grandma for refusing to let that be my story. On the anniversary of her hospice call, not her death, but that call, I sat down and listened to the recording one last time. Her voice was still thin, still steady, still unmistakably hers. But instead of pain, I felt gratitude. That call had done its work. It had protected me when I didn't know how to protect myself. It had forced truth into the open when silence would have buried it. And it had taught me a lesson that continued to shape my life long after the conflict ended. I turned the recording off and didn't replay it, not because I wanted to forget, but because the lesson had become instinct now. I used to believe that being loved meant being chosen first, chosen loudly, chosen visibly. Grandma taught me something different. She showed me that real love is intentional, that it plans ahead, that it speaks up even when doing so is uncomfortable, and sometimes that it makes one final phone call to ensure the truth can't be erased. My parents once used my inheritance to buy my sister a car. That fact will always be part of our history, but it's no longer the center of it. The center is what followed, the reckoning, the honesty, the growth. The moment I stopped being the easy one and became the honest one, the moment my family learned that peace built on silence isn't peace at all. If you're listening to this and wondering whether it's worth it standing up for yourself when the cost feels too high, I want you to hear this clearly. The cost of silence is higher. It compounds quietly. It shows up years later as resentment, self-doubt, and grief you can't quite name. Speaking up doesn't guarantee everything will work out neatly, but it does guarantee that you won't lose yourself in the process. Grandma didn't live to see how everything turned out, but she didn't need to. She trusted me to carry it forward, and I have. In my choices, in my boundaries, in my refusal to disappear for the sake of comfort. Her voice didn't end in hospice. It lives on every time I choose truth over ease. That is how this story truly ends. Not with bitterness, not with triumph, but with balance, with clarity, and with a life finally lived from the inside out.